The air at 12,000 feet doesn't just feel thin. It feels like a physical weight pressing against your lungs. 2.4 miles. That is the distance of the impossible. 15 of the most decorated Navy SEAL snipers in history, men who have ghosted through war zones and made shots that defy logic, all stood on this ridge, and one by one, they all missed. The wind was too erratic, the curvature of the earth too steep, the target too small. But then, a rookie stepped up. No combat ribbons, no legendary reputation, just a finger on the trigger and a shot that would leave the world's most elite warriors in absolute disbelief. This is the story of the 4,200-yard shot that changed everything. The Hindu Kush mountain range is not merely a collection of rock and ice. It is a primal beast that swallows the unprepared and mocks the elite with every freezing, unpredictable gust of wind. At 12,000 feet above sea level, the world exists in a state of permanent, jagged hostility, where oxygen levels are nearly 40% lower than at the coast, forcing the human heart to pump with a frantic, rhythmic desperation just to keep the brain functioning in the thin, biting air. This was the chosen arena for a black-budget military experiment designed to test the absolute bleeding edge of ballistic possibility, a place where the laws of physics seemed to bend under the weight of ancient granite peaks. The target was a 20-inch steel plate, cold, gray, and indifferent, bolted to a cliff face on a neighboring peak that looked like nothing more than a hazy shadow against the horizon. To the naked eye, the target was entirely invisible, consumed by the atmospheric shimmer and the sheer, terrifying vastness of the 2.5-mile chasm. Even through a standard high-powered military optic, it appeared as a microscopic speck, a tiny gray dot lost in a sea of weathered stone. The distance was exactly 4,200 yards. To put that in perspective, that is nearly 42 football fields of chaotic atmosphere, shifting thermals, and unpredictable energy. Standing on the jagged ridge were 15 men who represented the apex of human precision, the Tier 1 operators whose names were whispered like myths in the halls of power. These were men who had survived the humid, suffocating jungles of Southeast Asia and the blinding sandstorms of countless war zones. They were masters of complex narrative structure, understanding how to break a massive challenge into small, manageable segments to maintain total control over their environment. They lived by a philosophy of cause and effect, where every action had a direct and logical consequence, both in the immediate moment and in the broader scope of their mission. Yet, as they looked across the void, they felt a rare and unsettling sensation, the cold touch of doubt. The first operator to step onto the firing mat was Jax, a veteran with 22 years of service, a man who viewed the world through a lens of pure mathematics and raw, hardened grit. He carried a custom-built rifle chambered in 3.75 Enabler, a round specifically engineered to stay stable when the air itself tries to tear a bullet apart. His spotter lay prone beside him, whispering atmospheric data like a dark technical prayer. They were calculating the Coriolis Effect, the physical reality that while the bullet would be in flight for over 10 seconds, the planet Earth would literally rotate underneath it. They adjusted for air density, humidity, and vertical thermal updrafts rising from the canyon floor like invisible geysers. The sniper took the breath, found the stillness between heartbeats, and squeezed the trigger. Crack! The roar of the rifle shattered the mountain silence, a physical punch of sound that vibrated through the very rock beneath their boots. For 10 agonizing seconds, the ridge was silent as every man leaned into their spotting scopes, chasing the shimmering ripple of the bullet's trace. Then came the report from the range officer. Miss, 6 feet low and 4 feet left. Jax didn't flinch, but a heavy, suffocating frustration began to settle over the ridge. One by one, the other 14 SEALs took their turn, each bringing a lifetime of expertise to the line, and one by one, they watched the mountain swallow their pride. They answered every fundamental question of the mission, the who, what, when, where, why, and how, with perfection, yet the wind was a chaotic system that defied every ballistic computer. As the sun began to dip, casting a deep golden-orange glow across the peaks, the atmosphere shifted from professional confidence to a heavy, stagnant disbelief. It was then that the transport helicopter crested the ridge, its rotors beating against the thin air with a rhythmic thud. Out stepped the rookie. She had vibrant red hair that moved wildly in the wind and beer that looked too clean to have seen a single day of real combat. She wasn't carrying a standard-issue weapon. She carried an experimental prototype that looked more like a scientific instrument than a rifle. The SEALs stood back, their mouths literally open in a mix of amusement and skepticism, watching as this girl with no combat stripes prepared to attempt what the giants of the community had just proven was impossible. She didn't seek their approval. She didn't look for advice. She simply dropped into a prone position, her eyes locking onto the glass with a mechanical stillness that felt entirely alien to the warriors standing behind her. She wasn't fighting the mountain. She was waiting for it to reveal its secret. Every muscle in her body was a biological extension of the machine, a perfect fusion of human focus and advanced technical precision. The ridge went silent, the skeptics went still, and the math began to take over. When the rookie finally pulled the trigger, the sound was not the sharp, aggressive crack the SEALs were used to. It was a low-frequency thud, a heavy vibration that seemed to anchor itself in the bones of everyone present. It was the release of a massive amount of stored kinetic energy, calculated to a decimal point that humans weren't meant to perceive. This marked the beginning of the 10-second silence, a window of time where life on the ridge seemed to pause, and the only thing that existed was the journey of a single piece of lead across a 2-mile void. In the first 3 seconds, the bullet was screaming through the atmosphere at 3 times the speed of sound, fighting a wall of air that felt as thick as water at those velocities. The rookie had not aimed at the target. She had aimed at a patch of empty sky, trusting her calculations that the planet's rotation would bring the steel plate into the bullet's path at the exact moment of impact. While the bullet was mid-air, the rotation of the Earth was shifting the target peak away from the point of aim, a phenomenon she had accounted for with terrifying precision. By the 5th second, the round was at its apogee, soaring hundreds of feet above the line of sight, passing through a layer of freezing air that increased the drag and tried to pull the nose of the bullet off its axis. This temperature change altered the air density, which in turn changed the drag on the bullet. The SEALs watched through their spotting scopes, their breath hitching as they saw the shimmering trace thread through a violent clockwise swirl of wind in the center of the canyon. This was the graveyard of their own shots, the place where the invisible river of air had pushed their rounds into the abyss. But the rookie's shot seemed to be riding a different current, a path mapped out by a laser Doppler system that saw the wind not as a force to be fought, but as a medium to be navigated. At 7 seconds, the bullet entered the transonic zone, the most dangerous phase of flight, where the shock wave catches up to the projectile and tries to knock it into a fatal tumble. This sonic wash creates turbulence that can cause a bullet to yaw wildly. The trace wobbled for a fraction of a second, a moment where every veteran on the ridge expected the miss, but the unique weight distribution of her hand-loaded round held its integrity, cutting through the turbulence with a grace that was almost supernatural. The disbelief on the faces of the elite warriors was no longer a mask of skepticism. It was turning into a profound, heavy awe. In seconds 8 and 9, gravity became the dominant force, pulling the bullet down in a steep, calculated curve toward the distant peak. The rookie remained perfectly still, her red hair frozen in the stagnant air of the ridge, her eye welded to the optic as if she were still guiding the bullet with her mind. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. She was still visualizing the impact, her body a biological extension of the machine. Then came the 10th second. Across the vast chasm, a microscopic flash of gray appeared on the center of the steel plate, followed seconds later by the faint metallic ring of lead hitting steel. Clang! The sound was thin by the time it reached their ears, but it hit the men on the ridge like a physical blow. The target hadn't just been hit, it had been struck exactly 2 inches from the dead center. The impossible trigger had been pulled, and a rookie with no name had just retired every record in the sniper's handbook. The giants of the community looked at the distant peak, then at the girl, then at each other, realizing that the world they thought they mastered had just been rewritten in the span of 10 seconds. They stood in a silence so deep it felt heavier than the mountain itself, watching the rookie slowly exhale as she realized she had just shifted the horizon for everyone in the profession. The ring of the steel plate hitting the ground wasn't just a sound, it was a total demolition of the status quo. On the ridge, the 15 elite operators stood like statues carved from the very granite they occupied. In the world of high-stakes ballistics, there is a hierarchy built on what is considered doable and what is branded as impossible. These men lived and breathed the doable, pushing its boundaries every single day, but what they had just witnessed fell into a category that shouldn't have existed. The silence was finally broken by the veteran who had first attempted the shot. He stepped forward, his eyes not on the distant target, but on the rifle resting in the rookie's hands. To a layman, it looked like a standard sniper system, but to his trained eye, the proportions were fundamentally wrong. The barrel was thicker, the rifling twist was aggressive, and the material had a strange matte gray sheen that didn't reflect the orange sunset. The mystery of the shot began with the cold bore, the first round fired from a clean, cold barrel. As a barrel heats up from subsequent shots, the metal expands, and the point of impact shifts. This is why the veterans had struggled. After their first few misses, their equipment was fighting thermal expansion, changing the physics of the rifle with every trigger pull. The rookie's secret was that her barrel wasn't made of standard stainless steel. It was a composite of carbon fiber wrapping and an experimental ceramic metallic alloy. This material didn't expand. Whether it was the first shot or the 50th, the internal dimensions of the bore remained identical to 1/1000th of an inch. The veteran looked closer at the muzzle, questioning the twist rate. In a standard rifle, the twist refers to how many inches it takes for the bullet to complete one full rotation. At 4,200 yards, a standard twist isn't enough to survive the flight. The rookie's rifle featured a variable twist. The rifling actually got tighter toward the end of the barrel. This ensured that the bullet left the muzzle with the perfect amount of gyroscopic stability to survive the 10-second journey without tumbling as it slowed down. But the barrel was only half the story. While the elite team was using the best traditional glass in the world, they were limited by the human eye's ability to interpret light through the mirage, the heat waves rising from the ground that make a target look like it's dancing. The rookie's scope was an active sensor system that used a multispectral overlay. While the men were squinting through the heat waves, her scope was using a digital filter to subtract the mirage in real time. She wasn't seeing a blurry plate, she was seeing a high-definition digital rendering of the target, stabilized by an internal gyroscope that compensated for her own heartbeat. The disbelief on the ridge was slowly being replaced by a realization. These warriors had spent their careers mastering the human element of the craft, the breathing, the trigger squeeze, and the grit. But the rookie had mastered the mathematical element. She hadn't just felt the shot, she had calculated it until there was only one possible outcome. She had bypassed human biology with mechanical perfection. She began to disassemble her station with the same mechanical precision she used to fire. She wasn't celebrating, because to her, the hit wasn't a miracle. It was a foregone conclusion based on the integration of advanced tools and technical logic. The veterans realized they were looking at the future of their profession, a future where the legendary sniper isn't just a marksman, but a master of a digital battlefield where every molecule of air is a variable to be solved. As the last light of the sun disappeared, leaving the ridge in a deep shadow, the giants of the community stood back. They had come to the mountain to prove they were the best in the world, only to discover that the horizon had moved while they weren't looking. The echoes of the shot had long since faded from the canyons, but the ripple effect was only beginning to vibrate through the halls of military intelligence. On the ridge, the physical act was over, but the mental deconstruction had begun. In the world of high-stakes operations, a single event can invalidate years of established doctrine. For the 15 elite operators present, this wasn't just the loss of a record, it was a fundamental shift in the way they perceived the battlefield. They had spent their careers mastering the art of breaking a long-distance objective into smaller, survivable phases to maintain control. But the rookie had just proven that the doable range had expanded by over 2,000 yards. As the rookie began to secure her equipment, the veterans stood in small clusters, their voices low and urgent. They were analyzing the implications of what they had just witnessed. Traditionally, special operations were planned around a safe zone, a distance where enemy snipers could not effectively engage, allowing for a margin of error in base security and high-value target extractions. That safe zone had just been deleted. The ripple effect meant that every security protocol in the theater of war now had to be rewritten. If a rookie from a laboratory environment could reach out and touch a target at 2.5 miles, then no perimeter was truly secure. The rookie's tablet was still humming, processing the post-shot telemetry. In modern warfare, data is as lethal as lead, and she was already analyzing the performance metrics that had led to her success. The operators realized that her achievement wasn't based on a lucky gust of wind, but on a superior understanding of every fundamental question of the environment: the who, what, where, when, why, and how of the atmosphere. She viewed herself as a biological extension of a computer, using a projectile designed to survive the chaotic transition from supersonic to subsonic speeds without losing its axis. She had identified a specific point in space where 3 different wind currents converged and waited for the exact millisecond when the Earth's rotation aligned with her ballistic solution. One of the younger operators, a man who had prided himself on being the top marksman of his class, walked over to the edge of the ridge, looking out into the darkening valley. The disbelief was still etched into his features. For a warrior, confidence is a shield. When that shield is pierced by someone with no combat experience, it creates a psychological fracture. He thought about the thousands of hours he had spent in the dirt, the countless rounds he had fired to build his muscle memory. In a single 10-second flight, the rookie had rendered much of that sweat irrelevant. The ripple effect was hitting their morale. If the impossible trigger could be pulled by anyone with the right hardware and a background in physics, the prestige of the elite marksman was being fundamentally challenged. As the last of the purple light vanished from the sky, replaced by a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, the command staff arrived via a second helicopter. They didn't come to congratulate the team. They came for the data. The rookie was escorted to the bird, her prototype rifle encased in a pressurized container as if it were a holy relic. The 15 men were left on the ridge to wait for their own transport, sitting in the dark with the glow of their tactical watches as the only light. They knew that when they returned to base, the briefings would be different. The impossible label they had lived by had been replaced by a new, colder reality. The 4,200-yard shot hadn't just changed the record books, it had changed the very nature of the disbelief they carried. They were no longer the absolute apex predators of the long-range world. They were now students of a new form of warfare that balanced empathy for the craft with the direct, peer-like precision of advanced technology. The ripple effect would eventually reach every training school and every tactical manual, but for now, it lived in the minds of 15 men who had seen a rookie do what giants could not. The word miracle is rarely used in the vernacular of the elite special operations community, a group that prides itself on repeatable processes and technical mastery. In the world of Tier 1 operators, everything is supposed to be the result of training, equipment, and a strategic framework that breaks down complex missions into small, survivable phases. If something happens once and cannot be repeated, it is a fluke. If it is done with intent, it is a feat. But as the 15 SEALs sat in the transport bird, vibrating through the dark Afghan sky, they couldn't find a better word for what they had seen. They began to dissect the anatomy of that miracle, looking for the bone and muscle of the shot that had just rewritten their reality. The anatomy of this specific miracle began with the rookie's own biology, which functioned less like a human heart and more like a high-precision processor. While the veterans relied on their combat-hardened nerves and years of intuition, the rookie utilized a form of biological synchrony that was almost alien to them. She wasn't just holding her breath, she was using a biofeedback loop connected to her rifle's grip. The sensors in the chassis were reading her heart rate, her skin response, and even the micro tremors in her muscles. The rifle wouldn't even allow the seer to drop unless her vitals were in a state of perfect flow. To the SEALs, a trigger pull was a conscious decision made by a man. To the rookie, the trigger pull was a permission granted by the system once the biology and the physics were in total alignment. This deep integration of man and machine was the first layer of the miracle. The veterans realized that they had been fighting their own bodies for years, while she had simply turned her body into a secondary processor for the rifle. The second layer of the anatomy was the aerodynamic veil. At 4,200 yards, a bullet doesn't just cut through the air, it struggles against it with every inch of flight. The air is thick like syrup when you are moving at 3 times the speed of sound. The SEALs discussed the moment a bullet loses stability as it slows down, a phase they had all watched in their own spotting scopes as their rounds tumbled into the abyss. The rookie's projectile, however, had been designed with a specific tip that was sharper and more uniform than anything produced in a standard factory. This allowed it to maintain a smooth flow of air against its surface for a longer duration. By the time her round hit the target peak, it was still spinning with enough RPM to maintain its gyroscopic integrity. It was a miracle of engineering that looked like magic to those who had only ever used standard match ammunition. Then there was the geometry of the impossible. The 15 SEALs were masters of answering the fundamental questions of a mission, the who, what, when, where, why, and how, but they had always applied it to a 2-dimensional battlefield. They thought in terms of distance and wind. The rookie, however, was thinking in a 4-dimensional space. She had factored in the specific gravity of the mountain range, which was slightly higher due to the dense iron ore deposits in that specific peak. This extra gravitational pull, though minuscule, was enough to drop a bullet an extra 2 inches at 2.5 miles. She wasn't just aiming at the plate, she was aiming at the gravitational center of the mountain. The disbelief in the cabin was palpable as the team realized every time they peeled back a layer of the shot, they found more complexity. It wasn't just a lucky trigger pull. It was a symphony of variables, each one tuned to a perfect pitch. The final part of the miracle's anatomy was the psychological impact on the observers. For these 15 men, the disbelief wasn't just about the distance. It was about the fact that their entire identity as the unbeatable masters of the long shot had been challenged by someone who didn't even have a call sign. They began to realize that the 4,200-yard shot was a black swan event, something that is impossible to predict but has a massive impact when it happens. The miracle wasn't just that the steel plate had been hit. The miracle was that the world had just become much larger and much more dangerous than they had realized that morning. The anatomy of the miracle was now a part of them, a ghost that would follow them into every future briefing and every combat deployment. As the helicopter touched down at the base, the light of the moon reflecting off the tarmac, the SEALs stepped out into a different world. They weren't the same men who had left that morning. They had seen the anatomy of a miracle, and they knew that the impossible was now just a matter of the right calculation. The dawn that followed the events on the ridge did not bring the usual clarity. Instead, it brought a cold, calculated reality that had been forged in the fire of an impossible achievement. For the 15 Navy SEALs, the journey back to their base was a descent from the heights of legendary status into a valley of deep introspection. The 4,200-yard shot was no longer just a singular event. It was the birth of a new horizon in military history. This was the final stage of their transition from masters of the old world to students of a new, digitized reality. In the world of long-range ballistics, there had always been a glass ceiling, a distance where the variables of nature became too chaotic for human intervention to overcome. For decades, that ceiling had hovered around the 3,000-yard mark, a point where precision work typically dissolved into area fire. But as the sun rose over the base, the debriefing rooms were filled with a different kind of energy. The rookie had shattered that glass ceiling not with raw power, but with a needle-like precision that ignored the limitations of human biology. The tactical commanders, men who spent their lives analyzing the mechanics of success and the logic of engagement, looked at the data with predatory focus. They weren't just interested in the rookie's lack of combat ribbons, they were obsessed with the structural logic of her system. They saw a future where a single operator could control a 2.5-mile radius, effectively shutting down enemy movements across entire valleys before a single boot touched the ground. The 15 SEALs were eventually called into a final private briefing. Jax, still feeling the phantom weight of his own rifle, stood at the back of the room. The commanding officer didn't waste time on pleasantries. He explained that what they had witnessed on the ridge wasn't a fluke of nature or a lucky gust of wind. It was a proof of concept. The impossible was now being integrated into standard operating procedures. The disbelief that had started on the ridge had now matured into a profound, albeit heavy, respect. These warriors realized that their identity wasn't being erased, it was being upgraded. The strategy of breaking a mission into small, survivable phases was being expanded to include real-time atmospheric mapping and biofeedback loops as core skills. The rookie hadn't replaced the veteran, she'd given the veteran a new tool, a way to reach out further than any human had ever dared to dream. As she prepared to leave for the stateside labs, she crossed paths with the SEAL team one last time near the flight line. There was no boasting in her stride, and there were no insults from the veterans. Instead, Jax stepped forward and offered a simple, silent nod of acknowledgement, a gesture of respect between two different breeds of apex predator. She had answered every fundamental question of the mission with a level of detail that made the old ways look like guesswork. She knew the exact moment physics aligned with her intent, and she had the patience to wait for that alignment. The video of the shot, captured by the range cameras and her own internal optic, would eventually be analyzed by every Special Forces unit on the planet. It would become the ultimate benchmark, a story of an impossible trigger that would inspire 1,000 new theories in training schools from Quantico to Coronado. But for the men who stood on that ridge, the true story wasn't the hit itself. It was the moment they realized that the horizon is never fixed. It moves as fast as we are willing to chase it with the right combination of math, technology, and human will. The 4,200-yard shot didn't just change the record books, it changed the way we look at the world. It taught us that impossible is just a word used by those who haven't finished the calculation yet. And on that day, in the shadow of the Hindu Kush, a rookie finished the calculation and changed the world of the long shot forever. The world of the long shot will never be the same, and neither will the way we define our own limits. If this story of the 4,200-yard miracle gripped you, make sure to hit that like button. It helps the algorithm find more viewers who appreciate the art of precision. What do you think was the true key to this shot? Was it the revolutionary ceramic metallic barrel, the digital mirage filtering, or the cold, calculated mind of the rookie herself? Drop your theories in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And if you want to see more deep dives into the world's most impossible tactical feats and high-stakes military mysteries, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell notifications. You won't want to miss our next breakdown, where we explore the hidden technology behind the world's most secretive elite units. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon, and remember, the impossible is only a calculation away. Thanks for watching.